All right. Hello, students. Welcome to today's live class session on Indo-European migrations. So today we're going to be looking at the first of several people groups that engage in major migrations after the time period of the invention of farming, so after the Neolithic. And specifically, we're going to look at the Indo-Europeans today, and then 2 weeks from today, we're actually going to look at the Austronesian migrations in the Pacific. So if we're going to be spending time talking about migration, we might first want to do a terminology check and define what exactly migration is, and then also talk about what is diaspora, because even though the Indo-Europeans that we're going to talk about today don't meet the criteria of a diaspora, we will be looking at other groups later that do. And so it's helpful to understand because diaspora is related to migration. So let's talk about these terms. Let's look at migration first. At its most basic, migration is simply the movement of people. This movement could be one time, right? You move to a new place. It could be frequent moving. So like, for example, nomadic people groups, right? Those who don't really have like a permanent place of settlement, but continue to migrate, to move. Those are all examples of movement. So migration just simply means movement of people, and it's important to realize that that movement could be permanent, it could be temporary. When we look at ancient migrations, there are a couple of migrations that happen during or after the Neolithic that are very important, or in one case before the Neolithic, that are very important to understanding the history of people as they're distributed today. The Indo-Europeans migrating throughout Eurasia is the group we're going to focus on today, with a specific look at the Aryan migration into India, the Bantu peoples in Africa, the Austronesians in the Pacific, which we're going to look at in 2 weeks from today, and this is the pre-Neolithic migration, the peopling of the Americas. So the settlement of the Americas from peoples in Northern and Eastern Asia into the Americas is going to be a topic that we cover a little bit later in our textbook. Okay, so we haven't got to there yet. But this is the first instance in which we're talking about migration, is the Indo-Europeans. So that's why I wanted to talk a little bit more in detail about them. So migration is simply people moving around, right? We still have migration today. If you think about people migrating to the United States from Central America, right, which has been a topic of discussion, especially because we live here in El Paso on the border, right? People being detained, trying to come into the United States. Because we as humans have created rules about people moving around. When we talk about migration, that also counts, like, let's say you move to a different city for a new job. That counts as a migration. So migration is a very fluid topic to keep in mind. Now, diaspora is a little bit more fixed and complex. So diaspora is tied to migration because it does involve a migration. A diaspora, at its most basic definition, is a community of people who exist outside of their original homeland. So there's been some sort of migration out of their traditional homeland to a new place. And usually that migration is implied to be one time, one way, right? They're not constantly moving back and forth. They've gone to this one place. Oftentimes, this migration can be sort of traumatic, forced, and against their will, right? So sort of exile, seen as a form of exile. In order to be a diaspora, the community has to remain pretty distinct in their identity. Oftentimes that's coupled with opposition by the host community that sees this group as outsiders, as different. There might be some tensions involved between these two groups. And oftentimes, because this group does maintain their distinct identity and they do have tensions with the local community, there is a desire to return to the homeland, right? Because there's still that very strong connection. So as we're going to talk about today, Indo-Europeans do not represent a diaspora. However, we're going to look at throughout this semester other examples of groups that do meet the criteria of diaspora. For example, during the Hellenistic era, which we're going to talk about a little bit later this semester, the time of Alexander the Great or Alexander of Macedon, up until the founding of the Roman Empire, we do see a lot of Greek diasporas across Eurasia as Greek people settle these Hellenistic empires and establish settlements that look very much like the ones that they left in Greece. They're very culturally Greek. The Jewish diaspora is probably one of the more famous ones, right? With Jews saying that they came from their ancestral homeland of the Middle East, right? And then sort of being driven by various forces throughout the world, especially into places like Europe. And then even driven from there in more recent history by events like the Holocaust. And then we are going to get to this at the very tail end of our semester, but this is a topic more covered in the second half of world history, the African diaspora, specifically caused by the transatlantic slave trade. So this movement of African slaves to the Americas creates this population of African descent outside of Africa. Okay, and again, this is a forced migration. There are a lot more other criteria that scholars apply to diaspora. In fact, if you get together 5 different world historians and ask them what a diaspora is, they'll probably give you 5 different definitions. There are a lot of criteria that a lot of people apply to diaspora, but these are some of the basic ones that most scholars agree upon. Okay? And you're going to see why the Indo-Europeans don't meet this criteria shortly. So how do we study migrations? Because by nature, migrations mean movement of people. And generally, it's hard to track people's movement. Pretty easy nowadays with GPS and everybody having smartphones, right? You can easily track somebody's movement today. But it's really difficult in the past to study the movement of people. Difficult, but not impossible. So let's talk about some of the different fields that we look at to study migration. So historians have to work together with a lot of other academic disciplines to try to study the movement of people in the distant past. Archaeology is obviously a big one, although as I mentioned, movement is difficult to track, so archaeology mostly comes in when we look at where these people settle after they move, or maybe what the settlement looked like before they left a place. Anthropology, specifically, we can look at people's cultures or oral traditions and see whether they have stories of migration. We can also see whether there are similarities culturally between people that live in different regions, right? That might suggest a common sort of connection or ancestry. Obviously, history. We know a lot from societies that have writing systems and have recorded stories of migration, but not everybody does, right? But where we can, we use written historical sources. And then we also have linguistics. So linguistics can tell us a lot about migration because there are languages that are related to each other. And generally that tells us that there must have been at some point in time a kind of common place of origin for people speaking related languages, right? And that as they scattered, then their languages evolved to become distinct and separate languages that they are today. There's also a relatively recent newcomer to the study of migrations, and that is looking at genetics. So looking at people's DNA for evidence of population movement and population mixture, right? Looking at people's genetic material to see whether their ancestors predominated in that region or whether they were the result of people coming in from outside. Genetics is something that's only become a factor recently because of the difficulty of obtaining good quality ancient DNA. DNA as a material degrades very quickly, and especially in places with hotter humid climates. And so it's only as our technology to detect and recover DNA has become more sophisticated that we've been able to look at ancient DNA and to sequence ancient genomes. So, what's the typical story about Indo-European migration? I'm going to talk to you first about the general narrative of Indo-Europeans that we learned from most of those that we covered on the last slide. And then after I construct that narrative, then I'm going to talk about what genetics has added to our understanding of Indo-Europeans, especially only in the past couple of years. So we're going to kind of go through what we've learned from history, archaeology, anthropology, and linguistics about Indo-European migrations, and then we're going to see whether the genetic evidence that we're starting to see makes sense, fits into the general narrative, or whether maybe it tweaks our understanding of Indo-European migration. All right, so who are the Indo-Europeans and where did they come from? So Indo-Europeans refers to this group of people that existed and lived in an area around southern Russia today, and had settlements between about 4,500 and 2,500 BCE. So if you're looking at the map here on the slide, the Yamanya culture right here, this would be kind of considered the Indo-European homeland. Okay, so after about 3000 BCE, we start to see people from this culture in this region migrate to other places across Eurasia until about the year 1000 BCE. Some of these migrants go west and north into Europe. Some migrate into areas south, going into places like what we would today call Anatolia or Turkey, Iran. Some go east and southeast, settling into places like India and into Central Asia. Okay, so these guys really move around a lot. Now, why exactly does this people group start moving about this time period? That we're still a little bit unclear of. There's really no archaeological evidence to suggest a sudden sort of disastrous event. It may simply be that these people wanted a change of scenery. So Indo-Europeans, we know, migrate around this time period through a combination of data, right? We've looked at the archaeological record, and we've also looked a lot at language. So language is where the Indo-Europeans actually get their name, because Indo-European is the name of a language family, so a group of related languages. You can see here on this map all of the areas in which Indo-European languages are spoken today, minus obviously the Americas due to colonization. So how do we look at language? Well, to determine whether languages are related, we see whether there's similarities in those languages. The idea is that all Indo-European languages spoken today descend from an original language called Proto-Indo-European. And that today, as you can see here, covers nearly all modern languages found in Europe, northern India, and Iran. Okay, so we can see evidence of where Indo-Europeans settled. What's interesting is that we do have pockets of languages that are not Indo-European. For example, in Europe, languages like Basque, which is spoken in Spain and France, Finnish in Finland, and Hungarian in Central Europe, none of those are Indo-European languages, right? So scholars have theorized that those are languages spoken by people who lived there before the Indo-European arrival, and that those languages were lucky enough to survive. So in order to determine how languages are related to each other, historians and linguists look at languages to figure out what words they have in common. For example, if you look at the word father in English, it's padre in Spanish, It's Vater with a V in German, and you can Pater in Greek. So you can start to see that these languages are very similar. They are related. And then they look for words that are not similar at all, and that can tell you something. For example, the word elephant is not the same across all Indo-European languages, leading scholars to conclude that elephants were not in the area of the original Indo-European homeland. To give you a visual of Indo-European languages, this is the Indo-European language family tree. You can see down here at the bottom, this trunk represents a now lost original version of the Indo-European language. And then these are all of the different languages that branched out from it. So for example, we have Germanic. The Germanic branch, as you can see, has languages like Dutch, English, German, right? We also see the Slavic branch, so then we have languages like Russian and Polish. The Latin branch, so then we have Italian, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. You can see we have Iranian, so we have Pashto and Persian here. Greek exists as its own little branch. Indo-Aryan, so Hindi, Punjabi, for example. Gaelic, so Scottish and Irish Gaelic. Welsh are in there as a Britannic spinoff. And we have down here Anatolian, like Hittite, right, which is not a language spoken anymore. And you can see that there are some branches, like, for example, Tocharian down here on the right. Nobody speaks this language anymore either. So some of these languages have died off, are no longer in use. Some of them are dominant, but you can see how they all kind of intersect. Now, languages that are along the same branch of this tree are easier to understand. For example, if you were an native English speaker, you can probably understand a pretty good percentage of German. Same if you're a native Spanish speaker. Italian will be pretty easy for you to pick up because it's closer, right? It's along the same branch. But you can see here the sheer variety of languages that are all technically related to each other. So that's what language can tell us about where the Indo-Europeans came from and how they're related to each other. Then when we look at archaeology and anthropology, we can learn a little bit about what Indo-Europeans were like as a people, what their culture was like. For example, we know Indo-Europeans were very into horses. It's posited that Indo-Europeans may have been the first people to domesticate the horse around the year 4000 BCE. And the horse is very central to their migratory way of life. They not only use the horse as transportation and in service of military engagements, but we also see the importance of the horse in religious ceremonies and practices among Indo-European cultures. So the horse is very important to Indo-Europeans and very central to them. Along with the use of the horse, we also see Indo-Europeans embracing technological innovations. They're the early adopters for iron technology in Eurasia. Iron quickly comes to overtake bronze as a metal of choice for weapons and tools, in part because iron is far sturdier. It's far more common to find than bronze. And so that's oftentimes why you'll read things like the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, referring to the dominant metal technology of choice. So Indo-Europeans spread iron technology with them when they migrate. And a great example of this in your textbook is the Hittites in Anatolia, are an Indo-European group that use their control over iron, their dominance in iron metallurgy, to take over militarily other peoples throughout Mesopotamia. We also see the use of chariots. So chariots, which are drawn by horses, right, using these big wheels like you can see here in the mural. Chariots are an important military innovation. If you think about it, this gives you a more stable platform to shoot arrows off of than on the back of a horse. So the chariot is also another key to military victory for a lot of these Indo-European peoples as they expand. Now, the other interesting thing about Indo-European culture is the number 3 is very important. The fancy term for the importance of the number 3 is what we call tripartite, or 3-part. So Indo-Europeans loved the number 3. They made the number 3 kind of central to their idea of how society works. So they had 3 social classes with priests at the top, followed by warriors, and then kind of at the bottom, herders or farmers. And we also see the importance of the number 3 in Indo-European religions. Particularly, there's usually a god of law and order, a god of war, and a god of agriculture at the very least, right, as 3 central gods. So these are some interesting things that we see in common between different Indo-European cultural groups as they migrate. So as I mentioned, the Hittites that you read about already, the Persians that you're going to read about shortly, especially when we get to Cyrus, the Greeks, and the Aryans, who we're going to go into more detail in a second, are all examples of Indo-European peoples. So let's take a look at a specific group of Indo-European people, the Aryans, because this week in class we are covering India. Okay? The Aryans are the Indo-European group that migrate into India. The Aryans speak Sanskrit, which is an Indo-European language, and they migrate to India around the time of the decline of the Indus River Valley civilization, the Harappans. The exact date of when the Indo-Europeans come into India is oftentimes seen as a little bit controversial in India due to politics around race and colorism. When India is later colonized by the British, there is this thought process that the Aryans, who are seen as, again, kind of the whiter people of India, were the ones who were responsible for these beautiful cities in the Indus River valleys, that they couldn't possibly have been built by the indigenous group within India called the Dravidians, right? So there's lots of sort of colonial racial politics at play when it comes to talking about who the Harappans were. Most scholars do not believe that the Aryans were responsible for building the Indus River Valley civilizations because the timing just doesn't work. But there is a theory that posits that Indo-European expansion into India might have something to do with decline because it occurs around the same time. After Indo-Europeans migrate into India, they mix with the Dravidian population, and you can see the results of that mixture in the language map of India that we have today. So Indo-Aryan languages, so within the Indo-European language family, are here in the bright yellow, highlighter yellow-green. And then you can see Dravidian languages are in the blue. So you can see here the level of sort of influence of the Indo-Europeans into India. Okay. So Aryans arrived through northwest India, right? You can look at the map. I'm going to go back here for a second, right? It seems like they're coming in from the northwest and gradually going their way down. We're going to see the center of Indian settlement shift from the Indus River Valley to the Ganges River Valley in eastern India around the year 1000 BCE. The first cities will pop up in the Ganges River Valley region around 750 BCE, and that area then becomes a really important political and cultural center for India, especially under the Mauryan Empire you'll read about later. So when we look at the culture of the Aryans, we can learn a lot about the culture of the Aryans from a collection of work called the Vedas. So Vedas are the religious and literary works of the Aryans. Initially, these Vedas would have been preserved through oral history by being passed down from generation to generation orally, and then they're eventually written down in the sacred language of Sanskrit. Now, The estimate for oral stories when they began is a little hard to pin down. We estimate that the Vedas were written between 1400 and 900 BCE, so again, around the time of Indo-European migration into India, and that they were not written down until around 600 BCE. One of the most important Vedas is the Rig Veda. The Rig Veda reads like the Aryans telling their origin story of how they came to India. It shows the importance of war. It highlights the creation of the caste system among the Aryans in India. And it tells stories of Aryans sweeping into India in these horse-drawn chariots and laying waste to these walled cities, right, and taking over and conquering. So on the surface, some people read the Rig Veda and go, aha, this seems like it could be a story of how the Aryans swept in and destroyed the Harappans. Except for we don't really have archaeological evidence of warfare and destruction of cities like that in most of these Harappan cities. It's likely that there could be some minor military clashes between the Aryans and the Harappans, but for the most part, most scholars think that Harappans actually declined due to environmental change. The arrival of the Aryans might have complicated things, but we really don't have a whole lot of evidence of city destruction in the archaeological record like we see described in the Rig Veda. So the Rig Veda, the other Vedas are hymns to the Aryan gods, lines out the religious beliefs of the Aryans. And so because the Aryans come in with this belief system, many scholars have nicknamed this time period of Aryan arrival into India the Vedic Age, the period of time in which the Vedas are the dominant religious and social beliefs within India. We do see evidence for repeated conflict between Aryans and the native population, the Dravidians, a little later in other places of India outside of Harappa during this time period. And most of the organization of India during the Vedic Age is in small regional chiefdoms, which eventually will bloom into kingdoms towards the end of the Vedic Age, around 500. So the Vedic beliefs, right, the religious beliefs of the Aryans expressed in the Vedas is what gives us the social system that India is probably most famous for, the caste system. The caste system appears to have originated with the Aryans, that it does not appear to have existed before the arrival of the Aryans. And by the year 1000 BCE, we have four main castes, or varna, within the system. At the top of the hierarchy, we have Brahmins. They're the priestly class. Then we have Kshatriyas, or the warrior class. Vaishyas, or the merchants and artisans. And then at the bottom, Shudras, who were peasants or laborers. There's also eventually the untouchables. These are people who are considered without a caste or who've been kicked out of their caste due to violations. They're people that you don't want to associate with if you're a member of the higher caste. Those get added in around the year 500 BCE. So scholars have kind of posited that the social system was made in such a way that people of primarily Aryan descent occupied these three higher castes, which do line up with Indo-European social class systems, right? The power of three, and that they kind of incorporated this fourth section, the Shudras, to accommodate people who were indigenous to India. Okay. Within this system, there's also subcastes called Jati. Jati are located within each of these categories. And today there's an estimated thousands and thousands and thousands of Jati. Some scholars estimate as high as 40,000 different Jati. They start to appear in the 500s BCE, and jati is mainly tied to occupation. So like they're a subcaste within a caste group. But so today we still have thousands of jati, and there are complex rules governing the interactions of people within different castes. For example, you cannot marry outside your caste, okay, traditionally. It's not true today. Caste has been formally abolished since Indian independence, but for thousands of years, you had to marry someone not only within your main varna, but also within your jati, within that varna. So if you were a member of the kshatriyas or the warrior class, you could only marry someone that was not only a fellow kshatriya, but in the same jati as you within that kshatriya. This practice of restricting marriage to only within your group is what we call endogamy, okay, marrying inside your group. So this caste system was installed by the Aryans to preserve social order. There's some potential for upward mobility, but not usually for individuals. Sometimes, depending upon circumstance, is a jati or an occupation could rise up in status together, but not individually. As I mentioned, this also serves as a social network for marriage. And the system is very patriarchal. As you guys are reading this week in the Code of Manu, the section on women, women have no power outside of the family. They're expected to always be subject to male authority, whether it's their father, their husband, or their son. They could not inherit property or perform religious rites. And even though the law book or the Code of Manu is not written until the 1st century BCE, it does reflect this culture of the Vedic age. All right, so that's the traditional narrative of the Aryans and their arrival into India. How does our understanding of genetics change the story of Aryan migration, or does it? So, more knowledge of ancient migrations of Indo-Europeans, and specifically Indo-Europeans into Asia, has come out only in the past couple of years. If you are interested in how we look at ancient DNA and use it in constructing the past, I highly recommend the book Who We Are and How We Got Here, Ancient DNA and the New Science of the Human Past by David Reich. There's also the book A Brief History of Everyone Who Ever Lived. That's also a great book. I can't remember the author's name off the top of my head. But the information that I'm going to share with you, this genetic study of evidence of Aryan migration in the next couple of slides, comes from this book. So, looking at the genetic population of India today, India is an incredibly diverse nation when it comes to genetics, and even when it comes to appearance. And so scholars looked at the population of India, and they tried to kind of tease out where this population came from. Could they find evidence in genes of population mixture between these Aryans who came in a couple thousand years ago and the population that was already there in India, the Dravidians? In this case, they called them the ancestral South Asians rather than Dravidians, and then they called the Aryans the West Europeans in this study. So looking at the DNA of modern Indians and then being able to extrapolate backwards and to look at genetic strands they have in common, the study concluded that about 4,000 years ago, we have this mixture, this genetic interaction between populations. So again, right around the time period of the arrival of Aryans. Now, that's kind of interesting that we can pinpoint it pretty accurately. And part of that had to do with the fact that because people have only been allowed to marry within their specific jati, within the caste system for thousands of years, that's what made it really easy for people to look at this and pinpoint this with accuracy. So in other words, it's because of the caste system that we know so much about the Indo-European migrations, because once the caste system took hold, and people could only marry a very limited group of people within their social class, this made it so that basically it kind of like stopped the introduction of really diverse new genes. So we get lots of evidence of what geneticists call a bottleneck event in population, where you have one individual have a lot of offspring and then his offspring have a lot of offspring. What was interesting, though, was when they looked at the population today in India and they looked at genetics, they found a very big difference between mitochondrial and Y chromosome DNA. So mitochondrial DNA is DNA that you inherit along your mother's line. Okay, so it comes with the X chromosome. They found that the vast majority of Indians today, regardless of caste or social position or where in India they are, had mitochondrial DNA that matched ancestral South Asian population. But then when they looked at Y chromosome DNA, so DNA that you only get along your father's line, the male line, they found that it was overwhelmingly only from West Eurasian populations. So in other words, it seemed like people today in India are descended from an Aryan man and Dravidian woman. So they thought that was really interesting. Usually you don't see such a big difference. One example of more modern history where you do see a big difference like that between who the mother's line is and who the father's line is actually in the United States among African Americans due to slavery. So the mother's line comes from Africa, represented enslaved women. The father's line came from European descent, representing the masters. So generally what they kind of theorized was as Aryans came in and had more power, political power over the population that was already there, they became then more successful in marriage and reproduction, and they married into the local population. So they theorized that that kind of showed that this balance of power was off and in favor of the Aryans. So looking at this evidence, does it really change the story for Aryan migration? Not really. It does a little bit. For example, the people that were holding out hope that the Aryans were responsible for the destruction of the Indus River Valley civilization didn't really find evidence for that in the genetics. And again, as I mentioned, there's really not evidence for that in the archaeological record either. So this puts to rest this notion that Aryans kind of came in as described in the Rig Veda and laid waste to Harappan cities, right? What they did discover, though, was really interesting. Initially, the geneticists assumed that this mixture of Indo-European genes and ancestral South Asian genes dated to that migration of the Aryans. But then what they found is there was actually two different ways of migration. So in other words, the Aryans coming in from the north were actually the second wave of migration, and that there had been an earlier migration of people who were genetically related to the Aryans and the Indo-Europeans about 9,000 years ago. So in other words, about 4,000 years before the Aryans arrived, there's evidence of a genetic population from Iran that came into India and mixed. So in other words, when the Aryans got there, they weren't mixing with people just of traditional indigenous descent. These people were already mixed, in this case with Iranian farming stock. So this suggested to them that the story was much more complicated, right? And again, if we hadn't seen genetics, that might lead us to conclude, okay, well, people in India who have Indo-European genes today had to have gotten them once the Aryans arrived. But the truth is more complicated. Some of them actually would have gotten this Indo-European DNA from earlier contact and migrations, and that didn't show up in the archaeological record or the anthropological record or even the linguistic record. This is something that we only know thanks to evolutions and ancient DNA. So this is really interesting. This is an example of ancient DNA surprising us, of challenging our notions of the past. One of the really interesting parts of David Reich's book, when he has this chapter talking about India, is talking about how sometimes the genetic data challenges people's notions of themselves. He mentions that the study that they did that showed this actually was almost put on hold because within India, it's very politically sensitive to talk about key things of Indian culture coming from outsiders, right? So this narrative that the Aryans were the ones who brought in the caste system and everything else, all these in Hindu, what eventually became Hinduism, many people take offense to, and they say, well, no, this is the way India has always been. This is central to our culture. This is not outsiders. This is us. And so there are a lot of people who resist this kind of narrative of the Indo-Europeans coming in and bringing in key elements of culture. But now not only do we have this supported by the archaeological record, by anthropology, by linguistics, but now also reinforced through genetics. That still can be a really touchy topic, especially the Aryans are still a touchy topic because of German fascination with the story of the Aryans. If you are not familiar, the swastika, which today is associated with Nazis, actually originates from ancient Aryan culture and ironically was originally a symbol of peace. Now you can't see a swastika and associate with peace today. Everybody associates it with the Nazis. So this is an example of cultural appropriation and why sometimes it's really touchy to talk about the past, even if it's the distant past, because sometimes more knowledge, in this case from genetics, shakes our understanding of who we thought we were. So I'm going to leave you guys here today with this story of the Indo-Europeans. We're going to talk about Austronesian migrations when I next see you in 2 weeks. Remember, we don't have a live session for the week of September 16th, but we will be back to talk about Austronesian migrations, and I'll talk more about how genetics has changed that understanding too when we come back next week. Until next time, I'm Dr. Esmacher.